Welcome to Speaking of Grace, the weekly message podcast from the Whole Life Church in Orlando, Florida. We're a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-generational congregation committed to our mission of loving people into a lifelong friendship with God. We are committed to our vision of being a church without walls, fully engaged in serving the people of our community. Thank you for joining us as we continue Speaking of Grace.
Leviticus 23 tells us that the feasts, festivals, and the Sabbath belong to God. So why do Seventh-day Adventists focus on keeping the Sabbath and not the Old Testament feasts? In case you're not familiar with them, here's a quick look at the feasts in Leviticus. Passover remembers when God saved the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. They sacrificed a lamb and put its blood on their doors to protect them from the final plague. After Passover came the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For 7 days, the Israelites ate bread without yeast, symbolizing their quick escape from Egypt and the importance of being pure. The Feast of First Fruits happened around the same time, when they gave the first part of their harvest to thank God. Pentecost was 50 days after Passover and marked the end of the grain harvest. Later, it also became a time to remember when God gave the law at Mount Sinai. The Feast of Trumpets signaled the start of the Jewish New Year. Trumpets were blown to remind people to reflect and prepare for the Day of Atonement, the most serious day of the year when the high priest asked for forgiveness for the people's sins. The Feast of Tabernacles celebrated when the Israelites lived in tents in the wilderness, remembering God's care during that time. These feasts and the Sabbath helped the Israelites stay connected to their history and reminded them of God's faithfulness.
Well, hello there, family. Good to see you. I have a question. How many of you have lived in a country for more than a year that was not the country you grew up in? Raise your hand. If you've lived in a country that is not, okay. A few of you, it's the United States, right? For others of you, you've lived in other parts of the world that weren't where you grew up. And one of the things that I've learned through the years, having lived in a couple different places that weren't where I grew up, is that one of the strangest, and for me, could sometimes make me the most homesick, was holiday time. Because the first time that I lived away from home was when I was in New Zealand, and I lived there for a year. And there was no 4th of July celebration there. No fireworks, they for whatever weird reason, they didn't feel like they needed to celebrate the U.S.'s independence. I'm not really sure why not. But then I discovered something strange. They still had a holiday that involved fireworks. It was this one right here. You guys all familiar with this, right? Okay, some of you are. So if you're not, let me go ahead and explain this to you. So this is a British Commonwealth holiday called Guy Fawkes Day. And it is so uniquely British, I just had to talk about it. And by the way, you notice it's on November 5. Our barn party is on November 9. I have been thinking about just changing it to the Guy Fawkes. So we'll vote at the end of this. We'll vote at the end. Hold on, just stick with me here, okay? So for those of you not familiar with this, here's what happened. In 1605, a bunch of people were very dissatisfied with King James. And they were dissatisfied with him because he was a Protestant king and he was pushing a Protestant agenda. And so some of the more senior Roman Catholics in the British Empire said, we can't have this. We can't have this empire turning away from the true faith, from Catholicism. We need to get it back on track. We got to get rid of these Protestants. So they came up with a genius plan. They decided to go ahead and blow up Parliament. Just like here in the United States, about once a year, the president will give a State of the Union address. About once a year, the king would go to Parliament to present before Parliament. And so they planned on blowing up Parliament on the day that King James was there visiting. And so what they did is they got a whole bunch of gunpowder. and they leased a room underneath Parliament. Don't ask me how that's possible, but it was. They leased a room underneath there. They piled all the gunpowder into it. And the guy they had doing it was named Guy Fawkes. And Guy stayed there to guard the place. The only problem was somebody ratted them out. And so the authorities show up, and there's Guy going, nothing to see here, just a bunch of gunpowder, don't worry about it. And they're like, I think there's more going on here. And so truly the British are the only people I know that would celebrate the villain. Because they literally named this day after him. But one of the reasons they do it, it's called Guy Fawkes Day or Bonfire Night or Fireworks Night. And what they will do is they build bonfires, since he was unsuccessful in building his, and they will take effigies of Guy Fawkes and burn them on the bonfires. And so in later years it became fireworks, and so that is the 4th of July-ish, November 5-ish. Wow. There, so it's different, right? Now, can I just say though, that while we laugh about this and we think, okay, that's a different holiday, that's a little bit different, it does have some implications on the United States. Think about what would have happened if King James had been blown up. The Protestant king, who also happened to, what was the authorized version, that King James version, right? That came a couple years after 1605. So think about the implications that what would have happened had that plot been successful. Would it have had some implications for the United States? It might have. Might have had some very real ramifications for it. But let's not just talk about this holiday. Let's talk about this one right here. When I was in New Zealand, it was actually the Queen's birthday because it was Queen Elizabeth that was reigning at that point. But in the Commonwealth, they have a holiday in New Zealand for, and other Commonwealth countries, for the birthday of the monarch. And for instance, King Charles, who's now on the throne, his birthday is actually November 14. So I feel like we could do Guy Fawkes Day and we could do the King's birthday and just not worry about the barn party. And we can just, anyway, we'll talk about it. We'll vote on it at the end of this. And so anyway, but the thing about it is that in the Commonwealth, they do not celebrate on the actual birthday of the monarch. They actually celebrate it usually in the end of June. Why? Because the weather is horrible and unpredictable in other times of the year. And so June is usually a time where you can do the marshaling of the troops, and they do this big thing. In fact, I had one of our church members who was here afterwards said, I feel like you're picking on me. This is one of my favorite things. I do celebrate the King's birthday every year. And I said, where are you from? She said, Puerto Rico. Okay, very cool. Very cool. We are like this whole life, right? We're with you. So June 21, so this is a big deal. They celebrate it every year. And so this is different than President's Day, which would maybe be somewhat of an equivalent here in the United States. But there were some things that were the same. We did celebrate Christmas in New Zealand. The only problem is that in New Zealand, they're on the other side of the equator, and so it's the middle of the summer. So literally, they have Santa Claus in shorts. You know how we all sing about, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas? That song is never played. Like, it makes zero sense to them. And yet, here I am down there being like, well, but it doesn't feel very Christmassy the way I'm used to. Christmas is supposed to be associated with cold and, like, not there. Different. And so there are the holidays that were the same, but then there are the holidays that were different. Go ahead and put that all in the back of your mind. We'll come back to it later. So let's talk about the question that was actually asked. Some of you are like, okay, you have spent a lot of time talking about British holidays when what we asked you about was Jewish feasts. So let's talk about that. The text that was actually referenced was Leviticus 23. That was the text that I was asked to talk about. So let's actually take a look at Leviticus 23 and see what it says. Starting in verse 1, it says, the Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. These are the Lord's appointed festivals which you are to proclaim as official days for Holy Assembly. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath, a complete rest, an official day of Holy Assembly. It is the Lord's Sabbath day, and and it must be observed wherever you live. In addition to the Sabbath, these are the Lord's appointed festivals, the official days for Holy Assembly that are to be celebrated at their proper times of the year. Okay, so the question that you asked was, why do Seventh-day Adventists keep the seventh-day Sabbath but not observe the Jewish feasts that are found in Leviticus 23? Great question. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the similarities and differences of these two things, the Sabbath and the feast. At the very beginning, you saw a video that talked about some of the feasts. So can we just start off, when you're looking at here, one of the things I want you to notice is the Sabbath happens how often? How often do feasts happen? Once a year. Notice something else. These are to observe, the Sabbath is to be observed wherever you live. Does it say the same thing about the feasts? Something to think about. So let's jump into a quick look at the Sabbath versus the feast. So, let me ask you, I like your participation. When was the Sabbath instituted? You guys are smart. Where were the feasts instituted? Mount Sinai, right? So the Sabbath, we find the Sabbath in Genesis, very beginning right there, Genesis 1-2. We see God creates the earth in 6 days, and then on the seventh day, he rests from his creation, okay? The feasts we find in Leviticus, and we also find some of them in Deuteronomy and some explanations there of these feasts, but they are handed down to Moses up on Mount Sinai along with the Ten Commandments. These are all part of that law, that Jewish law that's handed down. So creation, we find the first mention of it at creation. Feast, first mention of it in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. That's where at Mount Sinai it's instituted. So let's talk about where we find the Sabbath mentioned. We find it mentioned in Genesis. Where else is it mentioned? It's a part of the Ten Commandments, right? So the Big Ten. The Ten Commandments, it's number 4. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And by the way, if you read that whole verse, remember the Sabbath day to keep it. Why? For in 6 days the Lord created the heavens, the earth, and all the references right back to that Genesis part, right? So where are the feasts found? Well, they're found in what Protestants and Seventh-day Adventists would call the ceremonial law. Now, I want to be transparent, and I want to make sure that you're clear on something. For Jewish people, there is not a distinction between the Ten Commandments and the rest of the law. There's only the law. However, Christians have made a distinction. Christians have said, okay, here's the Ten Commandments. That's why you'll see some Christians that think it's super important to have the Ten Commandments in public spaces. Because the Ten Commandments are here, but the ceremonial law, that's something different. Jewish people would not see that there's a difference between the two. The law is the law. It's all the same thing, handed down to God on Mount Sinai. But within Protestantism and the tradition that Seventh-day Adventists follow, there is a difference between these two things. So it's worth just kind of noting as we kind of start to ask ourselves why we do one thing but don't do the other. So let's go ahead and talk about purpose. Because this is always an important question to ask yourself. What was the purpose of the Sabbath? What is the purpose of the feasts? So let's start with the purpose of the Sabbath. I would suggest to you that the purpose of the Sabbath is a reminder to humans that we were created by God with no help. We did not have to help God with our creation. In fact, we're the last things that show up in the 6 days, right? Everything else is taken care of, then we're created. So God did not need us. And so, in fact, really the first major assignment we get besides naming the animals is the Sabbath. Sabbath shows up. We're there while God declares rest. And so, again, the Sabbath is this purpose, is this reminder that we can rest in God because he's got it all covered. He's got it taken care of. He doesn't need our help. And he created us and everything else around us. As a reminder of where our origins are, our origin story. Another purpose of the Sabbath is the opportunity to connect with God and to connect with others. This is another major part of our Sabbath, and we see it when Jesus lives it out. He talks about the Sabbath is made for doing good things. And the purpose is here for us to take time out to connect with God. We live in a very busy world, don't we? If you're like me, there are weeks when it can be very hard just to connect with your spouse and your children, or the significant people in your life. It can be very difficult to find time for them. And I believe God knew this, and I think he knew that we needed a break once a week to reconnect with him and to reconnect with each other. For me, I have felt this particularly in two different situations in my life. One was when I worked in the news business. One of the things I wrote into every contract is that I had an hour off before sundown to an hour after sundown on the Sabbath. That was a part of every contract I ever did, and it was super important to me. And I can tell you that for me, I had people saying, oh, that's going to hold you back in your career. But in the course of 3 years working in Guam, I went from a rookie reporter working in radio news to being the 6 o'clock anchor of the only local television station in the course of 3.5 years. So I don't think the Sabbath held me back. In fact, I would suggest to you that from my vantage point, the Sabbath was my advantage. I got rest. I had a break. I had a chance to recharge. I had a chance to reconnect with the things that matter most to me in my life, my God and my family. The other time was when I was working on my master's degree, and it was a pretty crazy time because I'm working a full-time job and I'm trying to get my master's degree, and I'm doing this with a lot of other people that are in the program with me. And I remember us having conversations, and they were like, well, let's get together and study on Saturday. I'm like, yeah, I don't do that. Well, what? Wait a minute, you're working a full-time job, so when are you working on this? I said, well, I figure out other times to do it, but Saturday is my day off. It's my day with God, with my family. It's reconnection. It's part of my religious tradition, what I believe in. Oh, you can never do this. You can't expect to get good grades and do that. Well, I want you to know in my undergraduate program, I was not a stellar student. In fact, I barely squeaked into the master's program because my GPA was just on the verge of being good enough to get in, and fortunately I tested well enough to make it in. It was close. But I want you to know I made that commitment to myself to not work on my program. And I've watched this happen for other students too, whether they're nurse anesthetists that I worked with in programs. But I actually graduated from that program with a 4.0, so it did not hurt me. In fact, can I say again, for me it was my advantage. It was my advantage. The Bible tells us that God honors those that honor him. In other words, my takeaway from that is that when we follow the instructions God gives us, he gave them for a reason. It's for our best good. It's what benefits us. And God loves us enough to say, hey, this is to your benefit. So what about the feast? Well, the feast, if you think about them, if you paid attention while they were being listed during that video, these are memorials of events that happened in Jewish history. Take Passover. Let's just use that as the example. What was that all about? Well, it was about them being freed from Egypt, right? It was when the angel of death passed over their homes because they had put blood on the lintels of their home. And the angel passes over them. And so this is a celebration of something that happened. It also was looking forward. Now, again, I want to go ahead and make sure that you're really clear. I have a friend who's a rabbi that was the rabbi of a congregation in Nashville, the same place that I was a pastor for a while. And we had these conversations, and he would say, Ken, those feasts don't have any correlation to your Jesus. They weren't forward-looking. You Christians read into it something that's not there. So for Jewish people, they don't necessarily see these as forward-facing necessarily. They see them as memorials in the past, celebrations, but they don't necessarily look at them as something that's forecasting something that's going to come. However, as Christians, we do. We see in all these different feasts, there is a sacrifice that's taking place. In fact, it was impossible. One Adventist theologian says that it is impossible to keep these feasts properly without the sacrifice of an animal. And so these events, the purpose of the feast were, for sure from a Jewish standpoint, to celebrate things that had happened in the past, to be a reminder of God's providence and leading. And then from a Christian perspective, they were also looking forward to Christ. They were looking forward to Jesus being here on earth. But they also brought the nation together. It was an opportunity, again, to connect with God and with others. That's what holidays often do, right? These holidays, whether it's Christmas or Easter, they bring people together. There's a reason why we set up extra chairs when it's Easter time here at Whole Life. Is because a lot of people will show up here because it brings people together. And so the same thing was true with the Jewish feast days. They would bring people together. They would spend time. There's a reason why Jesus got lost at one of the Jewish feasts when he was 12 years old. It was because they were all together. They were spending so much time. He was like, don't worry about the kids. They're off having a good time. And then they get down the road and they're like, wait a minute, where's Jesus? It's been a couple days. I thought he was with, because they were in community, they were living together, they're spending time together. And so these feast days were a major part of creating community and being together in that Jewish society. Jesus said in Matthew 5:17-18, don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So when you ask Ken Wetmore, Seventh-day Adventist pastor, why we celebrate Sabbath, but not Jewish feasts in Leviticus 23, what do you think Ken's going to say? Say again? Purpose achieved. But which was the Sabbath's purpose achieved? Seventh-day Adventists do not believe it was. We still believe we need to be reminded of an important piece of human history, all the way back in Genesis, where we were created by God and we didn't have to help with that. That this world is God's and we belong to God. And so when we celebrate Sabbath, we're celebrating something that happened for all humanity. We still think that you need rest every week. We think you need a break from the busyness of the world around us. And maybe no time more in history than right now. We need to be reminded that you need a break. You need to take a break and breathe and be with your family and be with God. On the other hand, we believe that the feasts were symbols of something that was going to happen, that has happened. We don't need to sacrifice animals anymore because Jesus, the perfect sacrifice, has occurred. It's not necessary anymore. And also that those events in Jewish history, they're great, they're important. And if you're Jewish, you might want to celebrate Passover as a part of your Jewishness. But those were a part of that culture and not necessarily the Christian culture that sprang up out of it. I want to tell you though, I do think it's important for us as Christians not to just take those feasts and put them on a fire and not pay any attention to them. Why? Because understanding the feast can help us actually understand the plan of salvation and give us a deeper appreciation for our Christian faith. It's one of the reasons why it really bothers me when I hear Christians belittling our Jewish neighbors and friends. We owe so much to Judaism. We can be grateful for the Jewish people. We can be grateful for what they have handed down, and we can be grateful for where we are now. But understanding these feasts can actually help us understand what's going on in the Bible. So can I just give you a quick couple for examples? For example, there's the Feast of Tabernacles that takes place. And this is where the Jewish people would build a shelter and live in it. And they would do that for a certain period of time to commemorate their time in the wilderness. Well, what was one of the problems that they had in the wilderness? They didn't have enough water, right? And so this particular feast actually corresponded with a very important agricultural part of their year where they really needed rain. And so during this Feast of Tabernacles, they would also pray for rain to happen so that their crops could be harvested and so that those good things could happen. So in the Bible, in the Gospels, it records that Jesus gets up during this feast and he repeats to them, out of him will come flowing rivers of water. And he says, I am the water. And he's basically pointing back to where Moses creates water where water comes out of rock after Moses strikes it. And he's basically saying, guess what? That's me. I'm that water. We're talking spiritually. We're talking that I am the spiritual answer to your thirst. To what has you thirst, that's me. And if you don't understand that during this festival, that's what they were praying for, that they were praying for water, for rain, you won't understand the symbolism of what Jesus is trying to get at when he says this. And it's like, oh, okay, that's nice. I mean, Jesus likes to talk about water a lot, so okay. Well, but he's actually speaking to his audience. They understand the undertones that he's saying. He's declaring himself their Messiah. And what about Passover? Some of you may not know this if you haven't attended Passover Seder, but what will happen is at the very beginning, there's a piece of bread, unleavened bread, that will get torn in half. Today, the larger half will be hidden in a napkin. It will be hidden somewhere in the house. The kids will go look for it near the end of the meal. Whoever finds it gets a prize. It's pretty cool. But in Jesus' day, the same thing would happen, except that what would happen is they'd take that larger piece and they would eat the rest of their meal and they would save that piece of bread till the very end. And it was set aside. In fact, the Jewish name that it has basically means dessert. It's saved for last. And the point of it is that this is the last thing you're going to taste at this feast. It is what they want the last taste to be in your mouth. So think about this then. So when Jesus takes the bread, most likely the bread he took during that Last Supper was this torn off piece of bread that from earlier, the dessert bread. And he takes it and he breaks it further and says, take, eat, this is my body. So he's saying, I'm the Messiah, and this is the last thing I want you to have in your mouth. This is the taste I want to leave with you. Pretty powerful stuff if you understand what's going on. It takes it even further than what you might originally know. And then let's talk about Pentecost. Pentecost came 50 days after the Passover. It was the celebration of Moses receiving the law on Mount Sinai. What happened when Moses received the law on Mount Sinai? Well, there was an earthquake and there was fire, right? The Exodus records that the mountain shook and there was fire and the people were terrified. In fact, they thought Moses died up there. It was so bad. So what happens at the Pentecost right after Jesus' death and resurrection? The disciples are in an upper room. They're getting ready to celebrate Pentecost, and they're in prayer together. And what happens? The room begins to shake. And what appear to be tiny tongues of fire now appear on their heads. You following along? God is saying, my law is now in you. You are my little temples. Because the same thing happens when Solomon's temple is dedicated and the Shekinah glory comes down in there. And so there's this backward look in both of these where the people would have realized this is a symbol of receiving, that God is in us. We're little temples walking around with God's law permanently in us because God, the Holy Spirit, is in us. Just like Moses on Mount Sinai, we have received a direct transfusion, and it's not external, it's internal now. You see how understanding what's going on in the feast can actually help you with your Christian understanding? So I want to suggest that it's really important for us to study and understand this. I think it matters. I also want to say that the purpose of the feast was accomplished by Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Therefore, it's not mandatory. to celebrate these things. And the final thing that I want to suggest to you is that the purpose of the Sabbath remains as a reminder that we still need to rest in Jesus, who created us without any help from us. And so that's why Seventh-day Adventists don't necessarily celebrate the feast, although if you want to have that experience, you can, just the same way that I might celebrate Guy Fawkes Day to have that experience, or the King's birthday to have this experience. At the same time, I don't make those holidays mine because they're not part of my country. And as a Christian, I celebrate Easter, I celebrate Christmas, I celebrate the parts of Christianity that are now a part of who I am and my identity as a Christian.
That works. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Ken. All right, I'm gonna do this now. All right, so my name is Matthew. If you don't know me, I help to do host behind the scenes. We ask questions. If you're interested, you can write to us at wholelife.live.
We like getting questions.
Oh, we like many questions. So, Ken, I don't know how I'm gonna do it. So, Ken, we talk in the first service, right? We touch on we talk about how should Christians discern and how they go about participate in cultural festival within the religious root. We acknowledge that this question alone, this subject, can sometimes tear us up as in our Adventist community, even outside our secular world. So, how do you want this, Ken? I have hard, hardest, or impossible. These are questions that you can answer.
Well, let's go with impossible, and I'll just say I don't know right off the bat.
You sure? Sure about that?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Okay, here we go. So Aaron asked, where does Colossians 2:15 through 17 fit in the claim that there is a difference between the Sabbath and festival? Now I have this queued up right now. Would you like me to read it?
No, I have it.
Okay.
The Colossians 2:16-17 says, "So don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink, or for not celebrating certain holy days or new moons, ceremonies, or Sabbaths. For these rules are only shadows of the reality yet to come, and Christ himself is that reality." And so what will happen is that a lot of the rest of the Protestant world will say to Seventh-day Adventists, they'll say, look, you don't need to do this feast and you don't need to do the Sabbaths. Seventh-day Adventists argue back that there's a difference in how you capitalize the word Sabbath or don't capitalize it. So in other words, when you look in Leviticus, it talks about the feast days being Sabbaths, lowercase s, but then it talks about the Sabbath, uppercase s. And so the distinction that Seventh-day Adventists have made is that when Paul's talking about this, Seventh-day Adventists believe that what he is saying is he's talking about Sabbaths, lowercase s, not uppercase s. And the reason for that is that throughout the rest of the New Testament, you don't see any place where Jesus or the apostles say, okay, don't worry about that Sabbath thing anymore. They appear to continue to keep it. It does appear that there are times where they are meeting on the first day of the week. But again, Seventh-day Adventists would say, well, take a couple of those examples. One of them is how you understand when the first day of the week is. So the first day of the week in a Jewish culture would begin when? It begins Saturday evening, when the sun goes down on Saturday. So sometimes when you look at it, particularly see one particular instance where Paul is meeting, it's late at night, a little boy actually falls out of a window, dies. Paul brings him back to life, and they were meeting on the first day of the week. Well, it would have been Saturday night. So basically, Paul is such a long-winded preacher that he goes all through the Sabbath hours, goes all the way into the evening, and on the first day of the week, they're meeting. The reason I didn't include this in the sermon was because for me, I really wanted to focus in on what the purpose of the Sabbath is. And my challenge to anybody out there, no matter who you are, is do you really think you don't need a Sabbath? And to me, it's that simple. Maybe it's not that simple for everybody else, but for me, the question is, do you think that you don't need the Sabbath? I think you do. And if that's the case, why would you keep a different Sabbath than the one that God made holy at the beginning? That's my take. And I have some very good friends who are in other denominations who will vehemently disagree with me on this. And we're still friends. But for me, I just know that keeping the Sabbath has always been a blessing in my life. It's been a huge blessing. It has made my life better. And whenever I find something that makes my life better, I like to share that with the people that I love and care about, because I hope it will make their life better. And if it doesn't, that's their decision to make. So when I look at Colossians, for me, it's an uppercase S versus a lowercase s, and that's the way that I tend to read it.
See, I like you mentioned that because someone from another group, on Facebook group, named Trifina, asked, well, is Sabbath keeping a salvation issue? Is it the way how we perceive things that makes it like not have that disconnect?
So is Sabbath keeping a salvation issue? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus is the salvation issue.
All right. I'm going to give you an easy question, make it a bit more modern. It's been something that we've done over, from the time we inhabit this earth. But Tito asks, would camp meeting be a festival we keep or celebrate to take place over the festival of the tabernacle?
Camp meeting?
Yeah.
That would probably be...
That's the impossible question, by the way.
Oh, is that the impossible one? So I would not... I don't see camp meeting being mentioned in the Bible, although there was a 40-year camping trip that happens in the Bible. I think that one of the things to think about is that any culture that's going to be successful has traditions and holidays. It's a part of being distinct and being a group of people. And so there are certain traditions that Christians have, and there's certain traditions that Seventh-day Adventists have. And sometimes they're very important to your spiritual walk, and sometimes they're just a part of the culture and being a part of a group that believes a certain way and does things a certain way. I would throw camp meeting into the latter.
All right, thanks. That's all the questions I have for now. If you guys are interested, I know this is a hot debated topic, but if you'd like to get the meat of the more detail and depth, please join us podcast at Whole Life Church, where Ken go through it. Randy asks more the question that weren't answered before, and I'll meet you there.
Cool.
Hi, this is Randy McGray, podcast producer and host here at Whole Life Church. Loving people into a lifelong friendship with God is our mission at the Whole Life Church, and our podcasts are designed to help facilitate conversations that help us grow together in that pursuit. Now that you've heard the message for this week, don't forget to check out the Whole Life takeaways for this message. Swipe up in today's show notes and join the conversation. Speaking of conversations, each Wednesday morning we take a closer look at the week's message. That's right, the one you just listened to. We discuss practical ways to apply spiritual lessons and ask honest questions about the issues we face as Christians, all focused through the lens of grace. Your voice is a welcomed addition to that conversation. We encourage your thoughts and your questions by sending a voicemail or text to 407-965-1607 or send an email to podcast@wholelife.church. You can find everything podcast related on our website, wholelife.church/podcast. And plan on spending every Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning with us as we bring you the Whole Life Church inspiration you love straight into your headphones. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.